The stagecoach left her in a gust of dust and cold wind. Cora Whitfield stood alone on the boardwalk of Bitter Creek with one small carpetbag in her hand and the sour taste of regret in the back of her throat. The town looked like most frontier towns did. From a distance, wood smoke-weathered signs, a church steeple rising above rough roofs, but up close it had the mean, tight-faced look of a place that had learned to survive by deciding quickly who belonged and who did not. She had come west for work. A teaching post, the letter had said. Room and board included. A new schoolhouse. Decent people. Fresh beginning. By the time she reached the town hall, she learned the school had closed before the first frost. Not burned as one man first claimed. Not delayed as another amended. Closed. Funds redirected. Children needed in the fields. There would be no wages, no room, and no use for a woman who had arrived with no husband, no kin, and no coin worth naming. 5 men sat around a long table and looked at her as if misfortune had walked in wearing a plain blue dress. You understand the difficulty, said Mayor Colton Reeves, smoothing one palm over a stack of papers he had no real reason to touch. Winter comes early here. A woman alone cannot manage. Cora kept her spine straight. I managed to come all this way. That was travel, said Reverend Pike. This is living. Alderman Boone leaned back in his chair. We are trying to offer you a sensible arrangement, Miss Whitfield. The word arrangement made her shoulders tighten. She knew that tone, knew that oily blend of pity and command. She had heard it before back in St. Louis, when men with clean collars and soft hands discussed what should become of women after scandal, after loss, after a father died, and left debts bigger than his good name. And what arrangement, she asked, would that be? The men exchanged glances, each waiting for another to say the ugly part first. At last, Boone cleared his throat. There is a man outside town, owns good land, timber, water, strong cabin, animals. He has no wife. Then he can go and court one. A few of them shifted, embarrassed, for the briefest second. He is Apache, the mayor said, as though that explained everything. Cora said nothing. Boone continued. His name is Chayton Grey Wolf. He keeps to himself. Came back from the war wrong in the head, if you ask me. Not dangerous most days. Just not fit for ordinary family life. Not fit. There it was, the frontier version of the same old cruelty. And why, Cora said slowly, would such a man wish to marry a stranger? He needs help on the property, Reeves said. And you need protection. Protection. Another word men like to use when they meant ownership. Cora's fingers tightened around the handle of her bag. You know nothing about me. We know enough, Boone said. A lone woman with no references in hand, no money to rent a room, and no safe place before the first snow. You are not in a position to be proud. Pride had little to do with it. Memory rose sharp and ugly in her chest, her father's funeral, her brother's gambling debts, her aunt's door closing softly but firmly after one too many warnings that a pretty woman without a husband could bring ruin just by standing in the wrong room with the wrong man. She had crossed 3 states for a chance not to beg. Now she sat in a cold town hall while men weighed her like feed grain. Reverend Pike folded his hands. We are given to understand that Grey Wolf is incapable. The word dropped between them. Cora looked at him. He went on, lowering his voice as though speaking delicately made the insult cleaner. As a husband, you understand. Not a real husband in the full sense. The army doctor said so. Whatever happened in the war saw to that. A silence settled over the room, not because they were ashamed, because they expected relief. They thought that would reassure her. No demands, no danger, no true marriage. A roof in exchange for her name. A body placed in a house beside a man they had already decided was less than one. Cora felt heat crawl up her throat. And he agreed to this. Yes, said the mayor. He is waiting outside. Outside, while they bargained over him. While they discussed the private injury of a man who was not in the room to defend himself. While they prepared to hand her over like a sensible solution to 2 separate inconveniences. She rose to her feet so quickly the chair legs scraped the floor. "I will meet him first." Reverend Pike frowned. "That is hardly necessary. It is to me." Boone gave a tired sigh. "Miss Whitfield, I do not think you grasp the danger of refusing." She looked at each of them in turn. "Oh, I grasp danger very well," she said. "I also grasp insult. And I will not marry a man I have not laid eyes on, while 5 others tell me what he is." No one spoke. The mayor waved toward the door with visible annoyance. "Fine. He is out there." Cora turned and crossed the room before courage could leave her. Her hand paused on the latch for one heartbeat only. Then she opened the door. The cold hit first. Then the man. He stood at the far end of the porch near the railing, hat in hand, broad shoulders still beneath a worn army coat gone dark at the seams from age and weather. He was taller than any man in the room behind her by half a head, maybe more. His hair fell long and black against the collar. His face was cut from quiet angles, high cheekbones, strong mouth, a scar grazing one brow. He did not slouch, did not fidget, did not look broken. He looked contained, like a storm shut behind stone. His eyes found hers, gray, clear, unblinking. The town had called him half a man. Cora's first thought was that the town had lied. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The sounds of Bitter Creek drifted around them, the creak of wagon wheels, a dog barking somewhere near the livery, the loose flap of a sign in the wind. But between Cora Whitfield and Chayton Grey Wolf, there was a stillness so deep it seemed to hush the porch itself. He tipped his head once. "Miss Whitfield." His voice startled her. It was low and worn, as if he did not waste it often, but it held none of the confusion or slowness the man inside had implied. There was no vacant softness in him, no hint of feebleness. If anything, his words came with the precise care of a man who had long ago learned that speaking was dangerous, because once it began, other things might follow. "Mr. Grey Wolf," she said. His gaze moved over her face only once, quick and respectful, then dropped to the carpetbag still hanging from her hand. "You came far." "Yes." The wind tugged at the hem of her dress. He noticed, shrugged off his coat, and held it out without ceremony. She blinked. "You will freeze. You are already cold." It was not flirtation, not gentleness dressed up to impress. It was simple fact offered the way a man might offer water. That almost made it harder to accept. Still, her fingers reached for the coat before pride could stop them. The wool was heavy and still warm from his body. It smelled faintly of smoke, pine leather, and the clean, bitter air outside town. "Thank you," she said. He nodded once. Inside the hall, one of the men coughed loudly, either to hurry matters along or remind them both that they were not truly alone. Cora ignored it. "They told me you agreed to this arrangement." "I did." "Why?" Something shifted in his face then, not offense exactly, but surprise. As though no one had asked him that yet. As though everyone else had assumed his reasons were unimportant. "The land needs 2 sets of hands," he said. "Winter is close. A woman came west for work and found none. I can offer shelter. It seemed better than leaving you to town mercy." Town mercy. For the first time all afternoon, Cora nearly smiled. "You do not sound grateful to them." "I am not." He said it flatly, calmly, without any effort to make the answer prettier. She looked at him more carefully. There was wear in him, yes, but not weakness, not emptiness. He held himself the way men held a skittish horse at the reins, steady, firm, always aware of what might happen if their grip slipped. His hands were large, brown, scarred across the knuckles. The right one flexed once and then stilled. She remembered the word the Reverend had used, incapable, and suddenly the whole thing felt filthier than before. "What exactly did you tell them?" she asked. His gaze did not waver, enough to keep them from offering me widows and daughters every season. Her breath caught. "So it is not true?" He took a long time to answer. The truth he said at last is not theirs to tell. There was something in the way he said it that made heat creep up the back of her neck. Not because of boldness, because of restraint. Because the sentence held an entire locked room of meaning, and he refused to open it for people who had not earned the key. She glanced toward the door behind her. They spoke of you as if you were livestock with a bad leg. I know. And you let them. His eyes hardened by the smallest degree. I let them think what makes them keep distance. Why, this time the silence ran longer. When he answered, his voice seemed to come from somewhere colder. Because distance is safer. For whom she wanted to ask. For them. For him. For any woman foolish enough to come close, but she did not ask. Not yet. Instead, she studied the porch rail. The frost beginning to silver, the far edge of the plank, the dark hills beyond town, and the life waiting at the end of whatever decision she made in the next minute. If she refused, she had nowhere to go. No room, no wages, no train east, no family willing to take her back without the lecture that always came with it. Pride did not fill a stove. Defiance did not keep snow from entering through cracked boards. If she agreed, she would be tied by law and name to a man everyone in town had already reduced to rumor. Yet here he stood, offering truth in the plainest shape he knew how. No false tenderness, no performance, no begging, shelter, food, safety. She asked the only question that mattered now. If I come with you, she said, will you treat me as something owed? The answer came at once. No. Not quick from eagerness. Quick from certainty. She looked up. He had not moved, not even an inch closer, but the air between them changed anyway. I will not touch what is not freely given, he said. Not your body, not your trust, not your silence. You will have a room of your own. Your work will be your choosing. If you wish to leave in spring, I will not stop you. The men inside had offered protection. This man offered freedom inside protection. That was not the same thing. What if I prove a burden? She asked quietly. A shadow of something flickered at the corner of his mouth. Not a smile. Something sadder. Then we will be two burdens under one roof, and the roof will hold. The laugh escaped her before she could stop it. Soft, brief, real. His gaze lowered at the sound, as though hearing her laugh did something to him he had not expected and did not trust. Cora pulled his coat more tightly around her shoulders. One more thing, Mr. Grey Wolf. He waited. I will not have my future husband spoken of like a broken tool by men who know nothing about him. She held his gaze. If I do this, I will decide for myself what kind of man you are. Wind moved across the porch between them. At last, Chayton held out his hand. It was a plain gesture, almost formal. But his eyes on hers gave it weight. That is fair, he said. She set her carpetbag down and placed her hand in his. Warmth. That was her first clear thought. The warmth of him despite the cold and the stillness, and the hard line of control he wore like a second skin. His grip was firm, careful, and startlingly gentle. Not weak. Never weak. When he released her, she missed the contact at once. Behind her, the door opened. Mayor Reeves poked his head out with open impatience. Well, Cora turned, straightened her shoulders, and stepped back inside the town hall, wearing Chayton Grey Wolf's coat. 5 men looked up. She let them see her face. I will marry him, she said. Then, because she wanted the blow to land where it belonged, she added, and from this moment on, you will show him more respect than you have shown so far. He is not your cautionary tale. He is a man. No one answered. Only Chayton entered behind her, silent and tall and terrible in his composure, and for the first time all afternoon, those men looked even half ashamed. Not enough. But half was a beginning. They married before sundown. No flowers, no music, no smiling ladies dabbing at their eyes. Bitter Creek gave them a minister a ledger and a room that smelled of dust and lamp oil. Reverend Pike read the vows in the same voice a man might use to bless a coffin before the ground took it. Cora repeated each line clearly. Chayton's voice stayed low, steady, and absolute. When the time came for the ring, he drew a narrow silver band from his pocket. Cora stared. You came prepared, she whispered before she could help it. His eyes met hers only briefly. I had one made when they wrote East for a teacher. Not presumptuous, not hopeful, practical. Yet something in her chest tightened all the same. He slid the ring onto her finger. It fit exactly. She had nothing for him but the promise in her voice, and perhaps he had expected no more. Reverend Pike mumbled the final blessing. Then, with a visible reluctance that made Cora want to slap him, he said, "You may kiss the bride." Chayton looked at her, waiting. Even now, even here. She gave the smallest nod. He bent and pressed his lips to her forehead. That was all. No show for the room, no claim laid before witnesses. Just one brief touch, careful as snowfall. The men in the hall seemed almost disappointed. Cora was not. By the time they stepped outside, daylight was draining from the sky. Bitter Creek had gone blue with evening. Chayton loaded her carpetbag into a wagon hitched beside the hitching rail, then offered her a hand up without a word. The ride to his place took nearly an hour. The farther they went from town, the less Cora could feel its judgment hanging over her shoulders. The road narrowed to a rutted trail. Dark pines climbed the hills. The air sharpened. One red band of sunset burned above the western ridge, then faded to ash. Chayton handled the reins with the same exact control he seemed to bring to everything. He did not speak unless needed. Yet twice he reached behind the wagon seat and laid another blanket over her knees without comment when the air grew colder. Once, when the wagon jolted over stone and she caught herself against the bench, his hand shot out, not grabbing, only bracing at her back until the wheels steadied again. Small things, wordless things, things no man in town would have noticed because they were too busy measuring what he might lack. At last, the trees broke. His home stood in a shallow valley cupped by pine and rock, a two-room cabin with a loft above stout-built and weather-tight. Smoke curled from the chimney. A barn sat off to one side. She could make out a split-rail corral, a chicken coop stacked cordwood under a lean-to, and farther back the dark outline of a spring house near running water. The place did not look lonely. It looked defended. Chayton helped her down from the wagon. His hands closed at her waist just long enough to steady her boots on the hard ground. Even through her dress and petticoat, she felt the strength in his grip and controlled, not hesitant. He let go the instant she found her balance. Inside the cabin startled her. Warmth struck first, then order. A fire burned bright in a stone hearth. Boots lined the wall by the door, cleaned and set neatly. Shelves held jars of beans, flour-dried apples, salt pork, and herbs tied in careful bundles. A long table stood near the window. 2 lamps waited trimmed and ready. Along one wall, books, real books more than half a shelf's worth, stood beside ledgers and maps. There was nothing careless here. Nothing soft for softness' sake either. But every inch of the room declared foresight. "This way," Chayton said. He led her up the narrow stairs to the loft. 2 doors faced each other across a short passage. He opened the one to the left. "Yours." Cora stood in the doorway, caught off guard again. A small room, yes, yet clean and prepared. Quilt folded at the foot of the bed, washstand filled, extra blanket over the chair, fresh kindling set beside a small iron stove. On the table near the window stood a chipped blue cup holding 3 late-season dried flowers. She turned slowly. "You did this." His shoulders moved once beneath his shirt. It needed doing. Needed. That was how men like him concealed care, by calling it necessity before anyone could mistake it for feeling. She set her fingers lightly against the back of the chair. "Thank you." He stayed near the threshold, never crossing fully into the room. "There is venison stew on the stove," he said. "Bread in the tin. Hot water in the kettle if you want to wash. I will bring up more tomorrow after daylight." "And where do you sleep?" He nodded toward the opposite door, across from you. It should have relieved her outright. Instead, the knowledge brought a strange, quiet ache. Not disappointment exactly. Something softer and harder to name. Because the separate room was not rejection. It was honor. It was the keeping of a promise, before she had even tested him with it. "I thought," she said carefully, "that perhaps you might think it improper. I think it decent." Their eyes met. There was no awkwardness in his tone, no hidden suggestion. Yet suddenly the narrow loft seemed too close, the space between their doors too full. Downstairs the fire popped. Wind pressed once against the cabin wall. "Mrs. Grey Wolf," he said, and something about the way he spoke, the new name, almost undid her. "You are safe here. Not happy. Not lucky. Not beholden. Safe. No one had offered her safety without asking for her gratitude in return in a very long time. She sank onto the edge of the bed after he left, listening to his footsteps descend the stairs. A little later, she heard the soft clink of a spoon against iron as he stirred the stew. A door opened and closed, likely checking the stock. Then silence. Then the creak of a chair by the hearth. Her husband. The words still felt borrowed. She changed into her nightdress behind the screen, washed at the basin, and braided her hair for sleep. Then she ate a bowl of stew that tasted of venison, onion, and thyme, while firelight moved beneath the crack under her door. Long after she banked her little stove and slid beneath the quilt, she remained awake. Not from fear. From thought. The town had said he was not a real man. But the room prepared for her hands, the warm food, the separate bed, the coat still draped over the chair downstairs. Those things felt more deeply masculine than anything she had ever heard bragged over a polished table. Near midnight, footsteps climbed the stairs. Cora held her breath. They paused outside her door. No knock came. No hand tried the latch. At last, the steps moved on, crossed the short passage, and entered the room opposite. Her husband had come as near as honor allowed, and nothing in her chest felt afraid. Cora woke to the smell of coffee bacon and cold morning light. For one brief second, she forgot where she was. Then the weight of the quilt, the rough plank ceiling overhead, and the silver ring resting cool against her finger brought it all back. She dressed quickly and went downstairs. Chayton stood at the stove. Broad back, turned one hand on the iron skillet, the other braced lightly against the table. Morning firelight etched the hard lines of his shoulders beneath a plain dark shirt. He heard her at once and stepped away from the stove as if careful not to crowd her. "There is coffee," he said. "Eggs. Bacon." Cora looked at the table. 2 plates. 2 cups. Butter already softened near the hearth. A jar of preserves open beside the bread. "You rise early." "I sleep little." The answer should have sounded grim. Instead, it sounded matter-of-fact. Another weather truth. She poured coffee, sat, and took the first bite of bacon. It was crisp and salted just right. Hunger delayed by worry the day before came back with force. He noticed. "Eat all you want." That nearly made her smile again. Outside, the morning came pale and sharp over the valley. Frost silvered the rail fence. A horse stamped once in the corral. From the trees beyond the cabin, crows called to one another. They ate mostly in silence, but it was not the strained silence of strangers, forced together. It felt more like a room still learning the shape of 2 breathing in it. When they finished, Chayton stacked his plate atop hers before she could rise. "You do not need to begin proving yourself before breakfast." Cora leaned back in her chair. "And if I wish to prove I know how to wash dishes." One corner of his mouth moved. Barely. "The basin is there." She stood and carried the dishes anyway. By the time she finished, he had already filled the wood box, fed the stock, and checked the water barrel. She realized this not because he announced it, but because the chores had simply been done between one glance and the next. "What am I to do today?" she asked. He seemed to consider carefully. "What do you wish to do?" The question startled her more than it should have. So many men asked women what they wished only when the answer did not matter. "I would rather be useful than ornamental." He nodded once toward the back window. "Garden beds need turning under before the ground hardens. Coop latch sticks in the cold. The mending basket is by the hearth. Do any of it or none. This is your house, too. Your house, too." The words landed in her more deeply than perhaps he knew. She tied on an apron and spent the morning discovering the shape of his life. The garden, though frost-bitten at the edges, had been carefully managed. Late carrots, squash, onions braided and hung beneath the eaves. He had built low frames to protect herbs from the first hard freeze. No weed had been allowed to get arrogant. Every path between rows had been tamped neat by steady boots. Inside the barn, she found tack cleaned and repaired feed-stored dry tools hung in exact places. A man did not keep such order if he had lost his mind, nor if he had lost interest in living. By noon, she understood something else, too. Chayton's restraint was not emptiness. It was labor. Constant, deliberate labor. Even his kindness came worked into the world instead of spoken over it. When she reached for kindling, there was already a fresh bundle split fine for her smaller hands. When she went to fetch water, the bucket closest, the door was lighter than the others, easier to carry. The sticking coop latch had already been planed smoother, though he had mentioned it as if the work remained. He had prepared around her without asking praise for it. He returned at midday from the north pasture carrying a brace of rabbits and one broken fence slat over his shoulder. Snowlight clung to the ends of his hair. Cora met him at the table where she had laid out bread and cheese. "You fixed the latch," she said. He set the rabbits down. "Mostly. You left the light bucket." His gaze flicked once toward the door, then back to her. "You noticed." "I notice more than people think." Something unspoken passed between them then. Respect, perhaps. He washed at the basin sleeves rolled to the elbow. Cora tried not to stare at the forearms revealed there, strong brown scarred with old white lines. The kind of strength built by rope rifle cold and work, not polished, not displayed, simply present. During the meal, she asked, "Why did you say you sleep little?" His hand stilled around the cup. At first, she thought he might refuse the question. Then he answered with the same plain honesty he had used since the porch in town. Some nights are louder than others. She understood at once he meant memory. War. The room shifted around the knowledge. Cora did not press. "If the nights are loud," she said quietly, "you need not go through them entirely alone." He looked up then. The gray in his eyes seemed colder in daylight than it had on the porch, yet there was fire buried under it. The look he gave her was not one of gratitude. It was almost alarm, as if kindness offered directly to him struck a place no one had touched in too long. At last he said, "You owe me no comfort, Cora." It was the first time he used her given name. She felt it in her pulse. "Perhaps not," she said. "That does not mean I cannot choose it." He dropped his gaze to the table and finished the bread in silence. That afternoon, she mended shirts by the hearth, while he sharpened tools on the porch step, close enough for her to hear the steady scrape of stone against metal. The sound became strangely comforting. Scrape, turn, scrape, pause, wind, fire, another scrape. Toward evening he came in carrying a split length of cedar. "For your stove," he said. "Burns slower." When she took it from him, her fingers brushed his. The contact lasted no longer than a breath, yet the room seemed to change shape around it. She turned to set the wood down, aware of him still standing there behind her, aware too of how easy it would be to imagine different kinds of nearness in this warm cabin and dangerous early dark. But he stepped back first. Always him. Always the wall before the want. That night after supper, he read while she darned stockings in the firelight. Not once did he ask anything of her. Not once did he let the silence become neglect. And when she climbed the stairs later, she found an extra folded blanket already waiting at the foot of her bed. No note, no explanation. Just warmth placed where she would need it before she knew she was cold. Cora touched the thick wool and stood very still. The town had called him less than a man, but she was beginning to think the town had never seen a man exercise power without cruelty before, and because they did not understand that kind, they had named it weakness. 3 days later, they went into Bitter Creek together. The road had frozen hard enough to ring beneath the wagon wheels. Cora sat beside Chayton, wrapped in her cloak and gloves, watching the town rise slowly from the winter bare valley. Smoke climbed from chimneys. Dogs darted between storefronts. Men stood in knots outside the feed store and turned openly when they saw who rode in. The staring began at once. Not curious staring, judging staring. The kind that wanted its own ugliness reflected back and became offended when it found none. Chayton pulled the wagon to a stop outside Miller's General Store. Before Cora could climb down, he was already there, one hand lifted. She placed her gloved fingers in his and let him steady her to the ground. A woman across the street watched that simple gesture and frowned, as though tenderness from him contradicted something she preferred to believe. Inside the store, conversation thinned. Mrs. Miller stood behind the counter with flour on her apron and suspicion in her face. Mrs. Grey Wolf. There was a faint pause before the name, just long enough to show the effort it cost her. Mrs. Miller Cora replied, "I hear you are settling in." "Very well." Mrs. Miller's gaze moved toward the door, where Chayton now examined sacks of feed, giving Cora room to shop without hovering over her. The shopkeeper lowered her voice. "If things are not as comfortable as you hoped, you may speak plainly. Not every arrangement turns out." Cora folded her list once between her fingers. "Mine has." Mrs. Miller blinked. "I only mean she said a woman from back east might find the life lonely." "I would sooner endure loneliness," Cora said evenly, "than listen to a room full of people tell lies about the man I married." The color shifted in the shopkeeper's face. At the far end of the counter, a younger woman pretending to compare thread suddenly paid very close attention to a basket of nails. Mrs. Miller stiffened. "No one has lied. People speak from concern. Concern is not the same as gossip, and gossip is not the same as truth." Before the woman could answer, the door opened again, and a heavy-set man entered in a wool coat trimmed too well for local trade. He smelled faintly of cigars and expensive pomade. Two younger men came in behind him, each with the broad shoulders and empty eyes of hired confidence. "Grey Wolf," he said pleasantly. "Still hiding in the hills, I see." Chayton did not turn from the feed sacks immediately. When he did, his face showed nothing. "Thornton." James Thornton smiled with all his teeth. "I heard congratulations were in order." His gaze slid to Cora. Though some surprises travel faster than others, Cora disliked him on sight. Men like that wore power as though it licensed them to touch what belonged to others. "She is my wife," Chayton said. Simple words. Not raised. Not angry. Yet the room seemed to cool. Thornton spread his hands. "Of course. No offense meant. I only wonder how a man who never wanted company suddenly found himself a bride." One of the younger men smirked. Maybe the doctor got it wrong. Mrs. Miller looked scandalized, but not enough to rebuke him. Cora felt heat flash through her. Not shame. Rage. She set her list on the counter and turned fully toward them. "The doctor," she said, "appears to have produced a town full of fools who mistake privacy for permission." The younger man laughed once in disbelief. Thornton's brows lifted. "Mrs. Grey Wolf." "I was only making conversation." "No," Cora said. "You were making sport." Chayton's gaze moved to her then. There was warning in it, not toward her. Toward the room, toward what might happen if pushed too far. She understood at once that he did not fear insult for himself so much as the sharp rise of whatever lived under that iron control. Thornton smiled more thinly. "You speak fiercely for a bride barely a week settled. Someone must, since the rest of this town seems content to chew on the private dignity of a man while buying his labor, coveting his land, and mocking what they do not know." That landed. Hard. Mrs. Miller dropped her eyes to the register. The younger man flushed. Thornton's politeness cracked at the corners. Land is often wasted on men who cannot make proper use of it. There it was. The real subject. Not scandal. Not concern. Land. Chayton took one step forward. Nothing dramatic. Nothing sudden. Yet Thornton stopped smiling. "My land is not for sale," Chayton said. "We have not yet discussed terms. I'm discussing them now." The silence that followed felt tight as drawn wire. Cora saw then what the town perhaps had always seen and misunderstood. When Chayton went still, it was not emptiness. It was force held on a short rein. Thornton gave a soft laugh, all silk and poison. "You may find in coming months that the valley grows less welcoming to holdouts. Then I will enjoy being unwelcome." Cora nearly smiled. Thornton's gaze shifted to her again. "I wonder whether your wife will feel the same once winter deepens." "She will not answer for me," Cora said, "and neither will you." The younger man muttered something under his breath, a vulgar word meant for wives and women who talked too boldly. Chayton moved so fast Cora barely saw it. One instant he stood beside the feed sacks. The next, he was close enough to the man that the air itself seemed to recoil. He did not touch him. He only looked. But the young man took a step back. That was all. No violence, no raised voice, only unmistakable capability. Thornton recovered first and tugged at his cuffs. Another day, then. Yes, said Chayton. Far from my wife. Thornton left. His men followed. The door shut behind them with a hard wooden clap. Only after they were gone did the room begin breathing again. Mrs. Miller found her voice. There was no need for such unpleasantness. Cora turned back to the counter. No, there was no need. Yet somehow it entered your shop all the same. She paid for flour, coffee, salt, sugar, and thread, while the shopkeeper avoided her eyes. When they left, Cora felt the weight of a dozen glances between shoulder blades all the way to the wagon. Once they were beyond the last storefront, and back on the road, winter fields opening wide around them, Chayton spoke. You did not have to defend me. She kept her eyes on the trail ahead. I know. Thornton is persistent. So am I. The reins creaked in his hands. For several breaths, he said nothing. Then, very quietly, most people prefer the easy version. She turned. What easy version? The one where I am the thing they say. It spares them having to look harder. Cora watched his profile against the pale sky. The scar near his brow. The hard set of his mouth. The fatigue never far from his eyes. A man shaped by war, yes, but also by years of being misunderstood until silence became easier than correction. I did look harder, she said. His jaw shifted. And what did you find? She answered before caution could stop her. A good man trying not to become a dangerous one. His hands tightened once on the reins. After a long silence, he said, That is closer than most. The wagon rolled on through the cold, and something between them changed permanently then, not into ease, not yet, but into trust, with its first true root in the ground. The storm came 2 days later. They had gone north to check a fence line above the creek, where deer sometimes pressed through in the early dark. The morning had begun clear enough cold but bright, with long bars of sun breaking over the ridge. Cora had insisted on coming. Chayton had looked at the sky, then at her boots, then simply nodded. By noon, the weather changed. Wind came first, sharp and sudden, slicing downhill through the pines. Then the clouds rolled in from the west, dark-bellied and low. Chayton stopped near a stand of cedar eyes narrowed at the ridge. We need shelter. There is no house this way. There is a hunting cabin. He reached for her hand. The choice happened without discussion. His palm closed around hers, warm and hard, and they began hurrying over frozen ground through the trees. The wind rose, carrying the smell of coming snow. By the time the cabin showed between the pines, a squat, weather-beaten structure tucked against a rock shelf, the first white gusts were already spinning sideways. Chayton got the door open with one shoulder. Inside was darkness, rough boards, old ash and a stone hearth, a narrow cot built against one wall, and a cedar chest at the foot of it. Nothing more. But it was dry. He shut the door fast against the wind and dropped the bar into place. Snow hissed against the outside like sand. Cora's teeth had begun to chatter. Without a word, Chayton knelt at the hearth and set tinder kindling, then split pieces from the wood stack kept under the eaves. His movements were quick and exact. Flint struck steel. Sparks caught. Flame climbed. Within minutes, the little cabin glowed in orange light, and the terrible noise of the storm fell back a little behind the walls. You are soaked, he said. Standing. She was. So was he. Snow had half melted through her shawl and sleeves. Her skirts clung heavy around her ankles. Wet hair stuck at her neck and temples. Chayton's shirt was dark to the skin across the chest and shoulders. There are blankets in the chest, he said, already turning away. Get out of the wet clothes. She hesitated. He faced the wall at once. I will not look. That should have settled it. Yet her numb fingers fumbled uselessly at the row of tiny buttons along her back. Chayton. He did not turn. Yes. I cannot reach them. A long pause. Then, do you want help? There it was again. The question. Always the question. Even now in a storm with cold climbing her bones. Yes, she whispered. He came to her but stopped just behind. Close enough for body heat, not close enough to touch without purpose. Tell me if you want me to stop. The first brush of his knuckles against the back of her neck nearly undid her. Not because it was bold, because it was so careful. His fingers moved to the buttons. One by one, he worked them free. She could hear his breathing now, slower than hers, deeper, as controlled as the rest of him. Her own breath trembled in the cabin heat. There, he said, when he reached the last one. He stepped away before she could turn. Cora changed as quickly as she could, stripped down to chemise and drawers, then wrapped one of the rough wool blankets around herself. When she turned, Chayton was again facing the wall. "You can look now." He removed his wet coat, then his shirt. Cora tried very hard to be decent and not stare, and failed at both. Firelight slid over the broad plane of his back, over scars, old and pale, one longer ridge near the left shoulder blade, another low along his ribs. Not decorative scars, not frontier boasting scars. War scars. He caught her looking only once when he bent for a blanket and turned. Neither of them spoke. There was no shame in his face, only alertness, awareness, and beneath it, a hunger he seemed to hold by force of will alone. They sat by the fire, wrapped separately in blankets, boots drying near the hearth, while snow drove wild against the roof and walls. The cabin was too small for distance. The storm made the whole world intimate. After a time, Cora said, "You told me once that distance is safer." Yes. For whom he kept his eyes on the flames. Usually everyone. She absorbed that. Outside, the wind roared through the trees in long, grieving sweeps. Inside, the fire cracked resin popping in the pine kindling. Warmth slowly returned to her hands and feet. Her heart, however, only beat harder. "Tell me about the war," she said softly. He did not answer at once. She thought he might refuse. Instead, after so long, the storm itself seemed to lean in and listen. He spoke. "I was a scout first, then a marksman." His voice had gone flatter, as though memory forced it thin. Good at waiting, good at seeing what moved where others did not. Men trusted that too easily. Cora drew the blanket closer around her shoulders. "They sent us ahead," he continued, "sometimes with cavalry, sometimes alone. I learned to stay still for hours, learned to make killing look calm. That kind of work does something to a man." The fire shifted. Orange light moved across his face. "When I came home," he said, "people wanted the old shape of me. They wanted talk. Noise, handshakes, wanted me to stand in rooms full of men and pretend the walls were not closing in. Wanted me to smile at women I did not know and let them step close, because that is what normal men do." His jaw tightened. I could not. The words settled heavy between them. "So they said you were broken." "Yes. And the rest?" He finally looked at her then. Gray eyes, fire-rimmed, exhausted, honest. The doctor asked questions I would not answer. Men in town watched me hold myself apart and gave that holding a name. His mouth curved with bitter contempt. It was easier to let them believe I could not be a husband than explain I did not trust what might happen if the wrong woman stood too near and I had no room left in me to keep my hands steady. Cora's breath caught. Not incapable. Afraid. Not of weakness. Of strength without safety. He looked away again. "I have lived 3 years by control," he said. "Every hour of it. Some men come back wanting to hit something. Some to drink. I came back wanting silence so badly I thought it would split me open. Silence. Distance. Order. Those were the only ways I knew to keep from becoming cruel. Cruel. The word did not fit him. Yet she understood what he meant. A man trained by violence, carrying too much of it home, might fear the day it leapt where it did not belong. Cora shifted closer by an inch, then another. The floorboard gave a small creak under her weight. He noticed. Of course he noticed. But he did not move away. "I do not think you are cruel," she said. "You have not seen enough. I have seen enough to know you would rather carve your own heart out than frighten me." Something changed in his breathing. Very slightly. "You should not say things like that." "Why?" "Because I hear them." The truth of that made her chest ache. She let the blanket slip enough to free one hand and laid it gently atop his where it rested near his knee. He went perfectly still. Not frozen. Not recoiling. Still in the way a man goes still when he has reached the very limit of his restraint, and knows that one more inch may end him. You were never less than what they said a man ought to be, she whispered. You were simply better than the men who judged you. He closed his eyes once. When he opened them again, there was no room left in them for indifference, only want, terror, reverence, need, all of it leashed, all of it looking at her as if she held the knife to the rope. Cora, he said. Her name in his mouth sounded like warning and prayer together. The storm beat hard against the cabin, the fire cracked between them, and the whole world seemed to wait. Cora did not pull her hand away. That was the first answer. The second was in the way she turned toward him, fully blanket-wrapped close around her shoulders' knees, nearly touching his by the fire. The third was the look she gave him, steady, open, unafraid. I choose what I see, she said softly, and I see a man who has carried his own strength like a burden, because no one else ever deserved its gentler side. His eyes shut once, as though the words struck deep. When he spoke, his voice had roughened. You should know what you ask. I know enough. No. He swallowed. You know enough to pity me kindly. That is not the same. At that, something hot flashed in her. She moved closer until the blankets brushed. I do not pity you. His gaze snapped to hers. I have been pitied before, she went on, keeping her voice low and clear, by men who thought a woman with nowhere to go should be grateful for whatever cage they named rescue, by women who called surrender prudence. I know pity well, Chayton. This is not that. The cabin went very quiet, save for the storm and the little sounds of burning wood. This, she said, is choice. A muscle shifted in his jaw. You are cold, he said, and the sentence was so plainly an attempt to save himself that Cora almost smiled. I was cold. She held his gaze. I am not now. The words hung between them. He raised one hand slowly, so slowly she could have stopped him 10 times over, and touched her cheek. His palm was warm, rough, trembling just enough for honesty. Every nerve in her seemed to turn toward that single point of contact. You are sure, he asked. She leaned into his hand before answering. Yes. That was when the wall cracked. Not shattered, not violently. It gave way the way ice gives under river pressure, suddenly, deeply, with a force long held back. He kissed her. Not the careful touch to her forehead from the wedding. Not the restrained, near gentleness of a man proving virtue. This was hunger, disciplined by devotion. His mouth found hers, like he had denied himself the thought 100 times, and now could deny it no longer. Heat surged through her all at once. She clutched the blanket tighter with one hand and slid the other up to his shoulder, feeling hard muscle and scar beneath bare skin. He made a low sound in his throat. Not triumph. Relief. Relief so fierce it broke her heart a little. When he deepened the kiss, he did it with astonishing control. He wanted. Dear Lord, he wanted. She could feel it in the way his breath changed, in the tension trembling through his body, in the hand at her cheek, turning possessive for one beat and then checking itself at once. But he never took. Never rushed past what she gave. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, his forehead dropped to hers. Tell me to stop, he said. Cora stared at him, dazed by the heat of his mouth and the nearness of everything about him. Do you want me to know? Then do not ask me foolish things. A stunned half-laugh escaped him, dark, rough, beautiful, and how unexpected it was. Then he kissed her again. This time she met him with all the answering want she had been trying not to name since the porch outside the town hall. Her fingers slid into his hair. His hand moved from her cheek to the back of her neck. The blanket fell from one shoulder. Firelight kissed her skin. He broke the kiss at once and looked at her as if the sight of her bare shoulder alone might be more than he had prepared himself to bear. That look did something dangerous to her. He touched the place just above her collarbone with 2 fingers barely there. So beautiful, he said the words seeming dragged from him against habit. No man had ever made such a simple truth sound more reverent. She reached for the blanket around his waist, fingers stopping at the rough wool edge. May I? His breath hitched. Yes. She drew it back enough to feel the hard line of his hip, the heat of him, the unmistakable evidence of everything the town had claimed he was not. A flush went through her, part desire, part fierce vindication. Yet even then, what moved her most was not the proof itself. It was that he had hidden this not out of deceit, but out of honor. "I lied to the doctor," he said, voice raw. "To the town, to everyone. I know. I did not want any woman handed to me like a duty. I would rather have died alone than touch someone who did not come willing." Cora cupped his face in both hands. "Then hear me," she said. "I am willing." He closed his eyes like a man taking the first full breath after nearly drowning. When he opened them again, there was nothing guarded left in the center of him. Still careful, still controlled, but no longer hiding. He stood then and pulled her gently to her feet. The blanket slid. He caught it around her shoulders before it could fall too far, almost instinctive in his protectiveness even now. The cot behind them was narrow-built for solitude, not for the kind of union waiting between them. Yet when he sat and drew her down onto his lap, the whole cabin seemed to gather itself around that small bed, the storm outside making the room feel apart from the world. He kissed her throat. Her pulse leapt beneath his mouth. She felt his restraint there too, the way he lingered just enough, then paused. The way one hand braced at her waist, while the other slid up her back, as if memorizing what he had been afraid to know. His breath warmed her skin. The fire snapped softly in the hearth. "Tell me if anything hurts." Such a man, such a strange, beautiful man to be full of desire and still think first of her pain. "It does not hurt," she whispered. "Yet." There was no swagger in the word, only honesty. He undid the ties of her chemise one by one, with hands that had likely loaded rifles in sleet and stitched wounds by bad light, and broken horses too wild for softer men. Those same hands trembled over a ribbon at her shoulder. Cora covered one of them with hers. "I am not afraid." "I am," he admitted. Of all the confessions that day, that one touched her most. She kissed him because she could think of nothing wiser to do. What followed belonged to warmth, trust, and the small lit cabin held against storm. It was not hurried. It was not crude. It was not some triumph to be boasted in a saloon by men who measured themselves by what they could take. Chayton loved like a man, unlearning loneliness with every breath. There was intensity in him, yes, enough to shake her enough, to make her catch at his shoulders and whisper his name against his mouth. But every inch of it was tethered to care. He watched her face, paused for her breath, asked nothing with words because his whole body was asking already and waiting. And when she opened to him at last, the world outside vanished. Snow beat against the walls, wind howled through pine, fire snapped and settled, throwing amber light over rough boards and scarred skin and joined hands against the blanket. She felt the full force of him, then not merely the undeniable truth of his body, but the truth of his soul. The town had said he was less because they could not understand a man who withheld himself until trust. Cora learned instead that he had the rarest strength she had ever known he could want with all he was and still choose gentleness. Afterward, he held her as though he hardly believed she remained real. They lay tangled under the blanket breath, slowing the storm gradually easing from fury to steady hiss. Chayton's fingers traced the curve of her shoulder, her back, her wrist, as if the fact of her there astonished him anew each time. No regrets. He asked at last, voice quiet enough to blend with the fire. Cora turned toward him on the narrow cot and touched the scar near his brow. Only one. His face tightened. "That you were made to carry their lies this long." Something broke in his expression. Then not control, but the loneliness beneath it. He bent and pressed his mouth to hers again, slower now, with a tenderness that somehow reached deeper than all the heat before it. Outside, the storm had nearly passed. Inside the hunting cabin, a marriage first made before witnesses became real in the dark, in warmth, in trust freely given. And if the town ever dared repeat that Chayton Grey Wolf was not a real man, Cora would remember the truth in his hands, in his restraint, in the way he had cherished before he claimed. The town had been wrong, not because he proved himself by force, because he proved himself by the kind of strength fools never recognize, until a good woman names it aloud. They walked back at dusk. The storm had spent itself in a white hush over the hills. Fresh snow lay across the pines and fence rails, turning the world quiet and blue. Chayton carried the blanket from the cabin over Cora's shoulders, as if she were something precious the wind must not touch too hard. Their gloves were damp, their clothes still faintly smelling of smoke, and their hands found each other without discussion on the trail downhill. Neither of them spoke much. They did not need to. Now and then, Cora caught him looking at her. Each time, a strange softness passed over his face there, and gone quickly, as though tenderness still surprised him when it arrived in his own features. At the cabin, he helped her inside, shut out the cold, and set water to warm. Everything they had done before the ordinary movements of husband and wife beneath one roof felt altered, charged, not awkward, simply true now, in a way it had not been. That night, he did not go to the room across the passage. He paused beside the hearth after banking the fire and looked at her as though permission still mattered just as much as it had in the storm cabin. "Will you stay with me?" he asked. Cora crossed the room and answered by taking his hand. The next day settled into a new rhythm. Mornings began in shared warmth and ended in shared work. He showed her how to cut kindling against the grain without splitting the handle. She showed him how to stretch flour farther in bread without losing softness. He mended harness, while she rendered fat and put away jars. He still moved through silence more naturally than talk, yet now the silence between them had heat in it. Sometimes, while she kneaded dough or turned from the wash basin, she would feel his hand slide briefly along her waist as he passed. Sometimes, she looked up from darning to find his eyes already on her. Not guarded, simply hungry and full of wonder that he no longer bothered to hide. But the valley did not mean to leave them alone. 3 days after the storm, Thornton came to the property. He rode up near noon with 2 men behind him and a smile already sharpened for insult. Cora saw them first from the porch, where she was shelling beans into a bowl. Chayton was in the lower field splitting a deadfall log. The axe stilled on the downswing the moment hoofbeats touched the air. Thornton dismounted with the confidence of a man used to entering other people's land, as though it were already his. "Gray Wolf." Chayton set the axe aside. "You are trespassing. Not yet." Thornton drew a folded paper from his coat. "Preliminary survey rights. There's talk of a rail spur through the valley. Development, opportunity, civilized progress." Cora came down from the porch before either man could continue. Thornton tipped his hat to her. "Mrs. Gray Wolf, charming as ever." She ignored him. "Your paper grants a petition to request access. It grants nothing else." His brows rose. "You read legal language better than men who rely on it to frighten others." The smile went thinner. One of the younger men laughed under his breath until Chayton looked at him. Then the laugh died. Thornton unfolded the paper anyway and held it out. Chayton read it with one slow pass, then handed it back. "She is right," he said. "You have no access." Thornton folded the document carefully. "You may resist, but every man in this valley eventually learns the future does not wait on his feelings. My feelings are not involved." That's so Thornton looked from him to Cora and back again. "Funny. Town says otherwise." Cora saw the change in her husband at once. Not anger exactly. Something colder. Still. Dangerous. "Leave," she said, before the air could worsen. Thornton did not. Instead, he smiled toward the cabin. "I suppose married life has agreed with you, Gray Wolf. Though I admit I took the old stories for truth." The younger man beside him grinned. "Guess the bride found out different." That was the moment Cora understood their purpose. Not the paper. Not even the land. They had come to pry at humiliation, to turn private dignity into public sport, and draw from Chayton the one thing they most desired: loss of control. She stepped between them. "You are filth," she said, her voice flat with disgust. "And if you speak one more word about my marriage, I will see this whole valley knows exactly what kind of coward hides behind legal stamps and hired men." Thornton's expression hardened. "Be careful, Mrs. Gray Wolf. No, you be careful. Because unlike you, my husband does not need borrowed men to make himself feared." Silence. Chayton's hand came to the small of her back, not to move her, only to anchor her there. She felt the heat of him through her dress, steady and sure. Thornton saw it too. Something calculating flickered in his eyes. "So that is how it stands," he murmured. "Very well. There are other ways to settle stubborn households. Try one," Chayton said. The quiet in his voice unnerved even Cora for a heartbeat. Thornton mounted his horse. "We will speak again." "No," said Cora. "You will threaten again. There is a difference." He rode out without answering. The yard stayed still after they left, snow-bright and untouched except for the hoof marks gouged across it. Chayton did not speak until the sound of them had fully faded. "You should have stayed on the porch." Cora turned. "So you could stand alone while they sneered over our bed like pigs at slop." His jaw flexed. "They wanted me angry. And did they get it?" He looked at her then. Really looked. "No," he said. "Then we won." For a long time he stood there in the brittle cold, his gaze searching her face as if he still could not wholly believe the shape of the ally he had been given. Then he touched her cheek with the back of his fingers. That slight, that gentle, and said the words she knew cost him more than other men's speeches. "My wife." Possession, yes, but not ownership. Recognition. That evening he told her more of the truth. Not all at once, not in grand confession. In fragments, while he repaired a hinge at the table and she peeled potatoes for stew. How a merchant's daughter in town had once been half promised to him before the war. How she liked the image of him more than the man. How when he came back changed, she had whispered first to her father, then to others that he was no longer fit for a woman. How rumor had spread faster because it pleased people to have a story for what they did not understand. "Did you love her?" Cora asked. He drove a nail through leather with one sure blow. No. Did she know that eventually? That answer satisfied her more than it should have, when they lay down later in the same bed and said, warm under heavy quilts, while wind moved gently at the eaves. Chayton drew her close and buried his face for a moment in the curve of her neck. The gesture was so unguarded, it stole her breath. "They will keep pushing," he said. "Then let them." His arm tightened around her waist. "I spent years making myself into stone." Cora turned to face him, and his eyes in the dark looked almost silver. "And you make me want to be flesh again." She kissed him because the world, however harsh, had given her one impossible thing, a man feared by fools and misunderstood by all, opening his battered soul in her hands. And she meant to keep it safe. Winter closed deeper over the valley. Snow crusted hard on the north slope. Water buckets filmed with ice if left too long after dawn. Bitter Creek became harder to reach and easier to hate, which suited Cora well enough. Yet trouble still found the Grey Wolf place by trail, by rumor, and by design. The first strike was supplies. Mrs. Miller sent word through a boy that no more flour or coffee would be sold to the Grey Wolf household due to inventory difficulties. The blacksmith claimed he had no time for Chayton's wagon wheel. The feed merchant doubled prices if a sale was made at all. None of it was spoken plainly, but the hand behind it was obvious enough. Thornton and his friends had begun squeezing the valley where law could not yet seize it. Cora answered by riding to Copper Run, the next settlement west, through a half-day of bitter wind. She came back with sacks of flour bolts of cloth lamp oil and an arrangement with a widow there who cared more for silver than local prejudice. When Chayton saw the wagon crest, the ridge at dusk piled high behind her, he met her at a run. "You went alone." "Yes, the road was icing. So I was careful." He took the reins from her with visible effort not to scold. "Careful is not the same as safe. Nothing about loving me is going to be easy for you, is it?" The answer left him before thought could soften it. "No." Cora smiled despite the cold in her cheeks. "Good. I have no use for easy men." He stared at her for one long beat, then pulled her down from the wagon and kissed her there in the yard with a kind of contained ferocity that made the coming dark feel warmer. But the valley was only beginning. A week later, Thornton's men came again. Not Thornton this time. 3 younger men, mean-faced and swaggering with a paper, claiming disputed water rights at the North Spring. Chayton read the paper in the yard while Cora watched from the porch rifle in hand, more for warning than use. The men grinned among themselves, too pleased with their own nastiness. One of them said loud enough for her to hear, "Town says she thawed the savage fast enough." Another answered, "Maybe he was only dead where it counted till she came along." The rifle stock bit hard into Cora's palm. Chayton folded the paper once. "Leave." The tallest man spat in the snow. "You got no right to stop inspection. I have every right. This land is deeded. Your paper is fraud. Maybe. Maybe not." The man stepped forward. His hand drifted toward his belt. Everything that followed happened faster than reason. Chayton crossed the distance in a blur. One moment, the man's hand hovered above his weapon. The next, Chayton had his wrist locked and twisted down so hard the man dropped to one knee with a strangled cry. The other two reached for knives. Cora cocked the rifle. The sound snapped through the yard like a branch breaking in frost. All three froze. "Take one more step," she said, "and I stop aiming near you." The air changed. The men had expected the quiet husband to crack, or the wife to shriek. They had not expected both steel and aim. Chayton released the first man with enough force to send him sprawling in the snow. "Get off my land." His voice had dropped so low it was almost calm again. That was what made it terrifying. The men stumbled back toward their horses, curses turning to mutters as they realized none of them wished to be the first to test how much violence still slept in the man before them. They rode off badly mounted and humiliated. Only then did Cora see the way Chayton stood, too still, too far away. The rifle grew suddenly heavy in her hands. She set it down by the porch and crossed to him slowly. "Chayton." He did not answer. Up close she could see it, the slight widening of the eyes, the breath held high in the chest, the terrible inward drag of someone no longer fully in the yard, but somewhere louder, bloodier, older. The war had him by the throat. Cora reached for him and stopped just short. "Look at me." Nothing. Snow hissed softly from the pines. "Chayton." Firmer now. "Look at me." His gaze shifted at last, but not fully. She put both hands on his face. His skin was cold from the air, his jaw locked hard as stone. "You are here," she said. "At home. With me." The words seemed to struggle through whatever darkness had risen in him. His breath broke. Just once. Cora pressed her forehead to his. "Listen to me. That was the yard, not the war. The barn is there. The porch is there. I am here." She repeated it until his breathing began to descend, until the terrible vacancy in his stare gave way to recognition, until his hands clenched so hard the knuckles blanched, slowly opened. When he finally came back, fully shame flooded his face so swiftly it pained her. "I almost know." His eyes shut. "I almost left you alone with that. You came back. I should never have gone." "Chayton." He looked at her then, and what she saw there was worse than anger. Fear of himself. The same fear that had shaped years of silence lies distance in cold rooms. She held him harder. "I saved you from nothing today," she whispered. "I only reminded you where home is." That did it. He pulled her into his arms with a force that would have frightened her once, and now only made her hold on tighter. His face pressed into her hair. His whole body shook once the tremor of a man who had stood too close to a cliff edge inside his own mind. "I do not want you seeing that part of me. I know. It is not fit for you. That is not your choice." He drew back enough to look down at her, almost stricken. "It is mine," she said. "The same way it was mine to marry you, mine to trust you, mine to stay." The shame in him softened into something rawer. Love, perhaps, when stripped of all ornament. That night, the wind turned hard from the north and rattled the shutters. Cora lit extra lamps. Chayton moved through the cabin, checking latches and bars, like a man relearning the shape of his own body. When he came to bed, he lay beside her for a long while without touching. At last, he said into the dark, "I would have killed him if you had not spoken." Cora turned and rested a hand over his heart. "But you did not. Because you were there. Then remember that." She shifted closer, fitting herself against the long heat of him beneath the quilts. "Whatever comes, remember where you return." His hand covered hers. In the darkness, with snow gathering outside and danger not nearly done with them, Cora understood the final turn of their story. He had saved her first, from cold, from loneliness, from a world eager to trade her life away. But love would not remain one-sided. To keep a man like Chayton Greywolf, she would have to help him walk back from the shadows whenever they came calling. She did not fear that. She had chosen him, and now she meant to choose him every time. The end came not with one grand battle, but with truth cornering greed until greed overreached. Thornton pushed too far. Word spread through the valley that he intended to force a commission hearing on the rail survey, backed by the mayor and 2 county men who owed favors to merchants with deep pockets. At the same time, Mrs. Miller's nephew let slip after too much whiskey that Thornton's riders had been seen near Dorothy Chen's lower well by night. The very weak rumors of contamination began. Dorothy came to the Greywolf cabin the next morning with frost in her hair and fury in her eyes. "I have had enough," she said, setting both palms on the table. "He tries to starve us each alone because he thinks none of us will stand together." Cora looked at Chayton. He was already thinking ahead. By week's end, 3 neighboring households had quietly agreed to speak. Dorothy Chen, a widower whose south pasture Thornton had fenced off by false claim. An old trapper who had hauled timber for Chayton once and still trusted him more than town officials in clean coats. None of them loved trouble. All of them recognized theft when it put on legal gloves. The hearing took place in Bitter Creek's church hall. Cora wore her plain brown wool dress and no expression of fear. Chayton stood beside her in a clean, dark coat, hair tied back, face unreadable. Yet she felt the live current of tension in him from the moment they entered. Townspeople turned in their pews to stare, some with curiosity, some with malice. Some now with the first uneasy suspicion that perhaps they had believed the wrong story for too long. Thornton sat near the front with his papers, Mayor Reeves to one side, and on the opposite aisle, all polished composure and winter blue silk, sat Clara Hayes, the merchant's daughter, who had once let the town think Chayton was not a man at all. Cora saw her eyes travel over them together and stop, not on Chayton first, on their joined hands. Good, Cora thought. Let her see. The county assessor began in a droning voice about development, public goods surveyed routes, and economic promise. Thornton spoke after smooth as lamp oil. He described Chayton's acreage as underused, isolated, wasted on a man unsuited to growth. He implied, without ever saying directly, that the valley's progress should not be delayed by the pride of a half-civilized recluse. Cora felt Chayton go colder beside her, not angrier, more contained. Then Dorothy Chen rose. She was not elegant. That helped. Frontier rooms often mistrusted polished women and listened to hard ones. She spoke of pressure threats, sudden trouble with buyers after refusing to sell. She named names. She named dates. The widower did the same. The trapper added what he knew of riders at night and forged boundary stakes found and removed. Murmurs began. Thornton's smile thinned. Then Cora stood. The room watched her with the same appetite for spectacle it always had. She let them. "My husband," she said, "has been called many things in this town. Broken, savage, incapable, unfit." Her voice remained even. Interesting that the same people saying those words also wanted his land, his water, his timber, and his silence. No one moved. She turned toward Thornton. A lie repeated long enough becomes useful to certain men. If a man can be painted strange enough, wounded enough, less than enough, then perhaps decent people will not notice when someone circles his property like a buzzard and calls it law. Thornton started to rise. "This is theatrics." "No," Cora said. "This is the first honest thing this room has heard in months." She faced the townspeople now. "You told me when I arrived that Chayton Greywolf was not a real man. I've lived in his house, worked beside him, been protected by him, loved by him." That word landed like a struck bell. Clara Hayes went still as stone. "And I will say in front of every soul here that he has shown me more honor, more restraint, and more true strength than any man who ever hid behind your approval." Silence. Then a different sound. Not loud, not cheering, but the shifting discomfort of conscience. Mayor Reeves cleared his throat. "This hearing concerns access, Rights, not private slander, was made public long ago. Cora cut in. I am simply returning truth to the same room. The county assessor looked less comfortable by the second. Thornton pushed to his feet, color rising. You overstep, madam. Chayton rose beside her. That was all it took. He did not loom intentionally, did not threaten. Yet the room felt the full reality of him standing there tall, scarred, silent, utterly self-possessed. My wife does not overstep, he said. You overreached. His gaze moved once across Thornton the mayor, then Clara Hayes. I told no man in this town my private life because none had earned that trust. You took silence and made it weakness. You took injury and made it spectacle. You took distance and named it defect. His voice never rose, and while you talked, you reached for what was mine. No one interrupted him. Even Clara lowered her eyes. The land stays, he said. The spring stays. My wife stays. If the county wants lawful survey, let it come lawfully and without fraud. If Thornton wants to buy, he has his answer. If this town wants gossip, it may keep it. I have no further use for any of you. It was not a speech designed to win hearts. That was why it worked. Because men like Thornton were strongest when the world performed for them. Chayton refused performance entirely. The assessor, now eager to distance himself from scandal, postponed all petition review, pending investigation of forged boundary claims and witness statements. Thornton argued. The mayor sputtered. It did not matter. The room had shifted, not into love, not even into full justice, but into doubt, and doubt was enough to break the momentum of a bully. Outside the church hall, the winter air cut clean and hard. Dorothy clasped Cora's forearm. You did well. So did you. When Dorothy moved off, Cora turned to find Chayton watching her, with that unreadable intensity she now knew how to read better than anyone. What she asked. He stepped closer. Snow crunched under his boots. You stood in front of all of them. Yes. And said those things. They were true. For one breath he looked almost lost. Not weak. Never that. But profoundly shaken by being seen fully and named without shame. Then he bent and kissed her in the open street of Bitter Creek. Not with the reckless heat of the storm cabin. Not with the urgency of nights when fear and hunger met. This kiss was slow. Certain and public. It told the town everything it had failed to understand. That a man did not become less by choosing restraint. That love did not diminish fierceness. That dignity once defended grows harder to take. When he drew back, the old hardness around his mouth had eased. Let them talk now, Cora murmured. His thumb brushed the ring on her finger. They will. Do you care? He looked toward the road leading home toward the pine-dark ridge and the cabin waiting beyond it. No, he said. Then, after a beat, not much. She smiled. That is enough. They rode back before dusk. Smoke greeted them from the chimney where the morning fire had been banked low. The horse shook frost from its mane in the yard. Somewhere in the trees, a raven called. Inside, Chayton set more wood on the fire while Cora kneaded dough for supper. The room glowed amber. Outside, winter leaned hard against the walls. Inside, there was warmth. Bread rising in a bowl near the hearth. A rifle over the mantel, stacked books by the chair, his coat beside hers on the peg, and the solid, ordinary holiness of being home. After supper, she found him on the porch, looking over the dark valley. She stepped into the crook of his arm beneath the blanket he lifted around her. What are you thinking? He took his time. That I spent a long while believing I was made only for surviving. His arm tightened. Then you came, and now I know I was still made for this, too. This. He lowered his face to her hair. Keeping. Belonging. Loving without fear. Cora leaned into him and listened to the wind move through the pines. The world had called him less than a man. Yet she knew the truth in his silence, in his scars, in the careful strength of his hands, in the way he had waited, rather than taken protected, rather than boasted, endured, rather than begged to be understood. The harsh land had not broken him. The town had not named him rightly. And in the deep winter dark, under one shared blanket before the house, they had defended together Cora Whitfield, Cora Grey Wolf, now by law and by heart, understood that real manhood had never needed the town's permission. It had been standing in front of her from the beginning, quiet, wounded, honorable, waiting for someone brave enough to see it.